VenomousStare back with a part of the Gregathon I did not think I would have access to. So in the last part of the Gregathon, which is a subset of the Venomous Classic series, a series in which I take a look back at classic StarCraft 2 games and contextualize them and talk about the effect they had on the meta and players' careers, this one is an absolute doozy for a ton of reasons. It's interesting that I'm doing every one of IdrA's GSL games, as we see him right there, because I'm doing every one and you would expect some of them just to be terrible and walk over, because the first 3 GSLs were open brackets. They didn't do like the GSL style groups. This was the first GSL that actually was called Code S and would do GSL style groups. It's the 4th GSL ever. 2011 January, Code S. MC won the finals of last season. The VOD was really boring, and I was going to do one of the transition episodes, but it's just really bland. The player that MC beats, TSL Rain, is not any good. Not to be confused with the Protoss player, Rain, the Protoss, who is a Brood War god and won a GSL as well. That guy's a legend. TSL Rain is just some mid-tier Terran player. And what's sort of funny is for these first few GSLs, Terran was actually so good that Terran players were on sort of a learning curve, in the sense that they didn't have to do as much in game to win as Zerg players, especially, and to a lesser extent Protoss. So a lot of them were so used to being able to do double bunker block and these goofy stem timing cheeses to get wins that a lot of them stagnated as far as their ability to macro and learning the game properly. And Liquid Jinro was the opposite of this. Liquid Jinro was a guy who dedicated his career and basically what he was trying to do and his mindset to the macro game. And even though the maps are really small, I mean, we see Jungle Basin here, the map pool had close position maps of any decent map, and then the non-decent maps, you had maps like Steppes, Lost Temple, Delta Quadrant. See, a lot of Terran players were just content to do aggressive, cheesy rushes. Jinro said, no, actually, I'm going to figure out how to macro on Steppes of War. I'm going to figure out how to do the safe macro build and actually learn how to play the game and not just do stem timings until the stem gets nerfed and the time it takes to research gets increased. And the same with the bunker, where the bunker salvage rate was lowered from 100% and the build time was jacked with infinitely. Famously, if you're familiar with that state of the game meme, where the bunker build time was messed with infinitely. Something In Control loved to joke about. So this map is Jungle Basin. IdrA once said that it's literally perfect for Jinro's style and he's nearly unbeatable on it. These two would go on, and this isn't really spoilers because this is a GSL style group and not just a straight up bracket like we saw before. These two would go on to play one of the most famous matches in GSL history in the round of 8 on this map, where IdrA basically was sitting to himself saying, I can't beat him in a macro game even though I'm the macro machine. Jungle Basin is too chodish, too claustrophobic, you can't take a third, it's too perfect for Jinro. And of course we're going to cover that game in the future, but IdrA cheesed, and he cheeses in a really shocking way. And you've got to remember how IdrA was criticized by a lot of his detractors at this time. People would always say, oh, IdrA, whenever he loses the first game of a series, he tilts, and he always does the same thing. He's too robotic, he doesn't cheese enough. And these are two things that I have found not really to be true. I've seen IdrA at his best whenever he loses the first couple games of the series and has comebacks. The IPL, the first ever IPL 1 versus Kiwikaki comes to mind, where IdrA loses 2 macro games in a pretty convincing fashion, and then goes for drops in games 4 and 5 to come back and reverse sweep Kiwikaki. I feel like this meme where IdrA sort of had a terrible mindset and would give up, especially deep into his Wings of Liberty career, that was sort of ridiculous and played out. But of course there were a lot of really famous moments at the peak of the game at tournaments where tons of people were at, where he leaves against Huck with the hallucinated void rays. He leaves against MMA whenever MMA killed his own command center hilariously. Like, you can see why that meme sort of existed, but I think it was a bit overblown. And when we look at Korea IdrA specifically, Zerg was so bad and was so vulnerable that everything IdrA really said came to fruition and was proven true in the last best of 3. As we see him hiding a nice little baneling nest here and not just putting it right by his hatch, trying to avoid a scan there. But you had to keep in mind that Terran had all these different advantages and different options to go to, and it was very hard for Zerg to scout, and the maps were chodish, had bunker block restrictions, and you could spawn in close. You were in this weird position where even if you were way better than your opponent as Zerg, you were still at a disadvantage in many cases, especially if the map was funky. We can see last series, IdrA vs MVP, as we see Jinro's going to push out and kill the spotterling. IdrA basically had 2 terrible maps, one of them literally the worst EVT map in StarCraft II history, and then he sort of refuged. The 3rd map ended up being close positions. It sort of screws up the minutia of like, oh, this is a good map, a safe map, a macro map, and this one's like the rush map. If the macro map can be turned into like the worst map in the pool, so that's why they took the close positions away. That one took a few months to do, but it really took them forever and a day to start putting the neutral depot at the base of ramps. Tournaments just started doing that in like mid-2011. They would just use custom versions of the ladder map with little neutral depots at the bottom because the double bunker block is just moronic. Gotta remember, no Ravager at the time. Jinro was one of the best Foreigner players at this time, and he was an absolute terror in terms of macro and safe play. So many of the players, like your Marine Kings, your Hyperdubs, your Makas, they were doing aggressive pushes, your stem timings, your 2-base tank pushes without medevacs, your proxy 2 Raxes, your bunker blocks, etc., etc. Jinro was trying to figure out how to play in a correct macro mindset, and even though he missed out on the first couple GSL qualifiers because of it, he failed to qualify to get into GSL. Because, let's be real, you're sitting to yourself saying, how am I going to macro on Steps of War? How do I take my natural on Delta Quadrant and Steps of War? It's like, very difficult question when everyone else on the server is fucking cheesing. So after those couple shortfalls, he overcame those obstacles and, of course, did well and started qualifying for GSL and doing real damage. And I made an entire Christmas special over Jinro. Sorry there was no Christmas video out this last year. I had some IRL stuff come up unexpectedly that prevented me from recording, but I did a whole Christmas special over why Jinro is a good macro player and so impactful to the game. One interesting thing about this era is a lot of it had to do with the fact that the bases were harder to take and the AI was worse, but the upgrades were a way bigger deal and the ramp up to get the upgrades were a big deal. Now in ZVT, yeah, the upgrades are still a big deal, but it's just different in terms of how it times out. The game we see now is so fast, and you're in the mid game almost immediately. The game that we play now is a game that is meant to appeal to the lowest common denominator. The Legacy of the Void game, in which you absolutely tumble right into the mid and late game, even though there are corny things like Reaper and Adept to make you feel like you're in the early game. It's just so banal and boring. Really, I prefer like the tempo of HOTS and Wings of Liberty, and I think that Legacy of the Void, not just because of the lack of patches and the pacing of the game itself, but just the way that it played out in the early mid game, bared itself out in the different decisions the players had to make. I feel like there is a certain charm and mystique to Wings of Liberty, even if you do accurately point out that the games were lower quality and people were still learning the game. It's like, yeah, of course the games are lower quality. IdrA and Jinro were playing like between game like probably like 2,000 and 4,000 considering they were pro gamers. But most of us were on game like 0 to 100 at this time, January of 2011. And these pro gamers hadn't figured everything out yet, and the best of the best pro gamers, your Flashes, your Jaedongs, your Busus, they hadn't switched over. So basically it was players like MVP were at the absolute top when it came to the players that did switch over from the Korean side. Jinro was ranging out to take his third. The trick here is you just make it a PF, and Zerg is never going to break it, and the Zerg can never take their version of that third. Notice how Jinro made multiple turrets in the main. He knows that IdrA wants to knife in and fuck with his main. It's one of the only ways that IdrA will ever be able to do damage in that sense, because Zerg in this era, Roach Hydra was a joke. There was no Viper, so you're pretty much going to go Mutaling Baneling. But on maps this chodish where you could button up so easily, you could very easily stifle the mutas and just get ahead in upgrades. And really, when you're 3-base to 3-base with the Zerg, your ahead is Terran, and you just get buttoned up, play real safe, and you do a nice little push with Thor. And where do you defend if you're Zerg, and where do you attack if you're Zerg? In terms of defending, you got that extremely narrow chodish corner base, either left or right. These bases were so hard to defend and bad for Zerg that many Zergs would elect to just take both and sort of just say fuck it, one of them's gonna die, and just sort of give up on that fact and concede to it. But thankfully IdrA ran in and picked up a mere 5 SCVs just to be cute. But as soon as IdrA pushes, Jinro pushes the other side, he says, do you have this base? I know you don't have the middle base because I got the tower and can see the whole thing. This is why the chodish, claustrophobic nature of this map was so tough for Zerg. We can see that where is IdrA going to take his 4th or 5th? And God forbid if he needs a 6th or a 7th, they're literally not on the map. But Jinro's set up in the middle there with a PF, with turret and tank, and he's rallied out there. It's a screen away from his main. IdrA is never going to be able to take that right side base that has a freaking back path to Jinro's base. So he sort of has to like take his left side base, which is hard to defend, and then be like, I guess I'll take the middle, LOL. But the middle is completely indefensible. IdrA's pretty much maxed here, 35 mutas. He's probably going to make a bunch of Banes and try to go in, or just try to go in, as IdrA knows that he can't win a super long game just because of the map. Lots of siege tanks here for IdrA, and IdrA cleans up the siege tanks of Jinro. Very beautiful stuff to see. IdrA basically controlled that perfectly, but this is the bread and butter of, oh, the map is small. What does that mean for Zerg? Well, Zerg traded favorably, and Terran is going to push and not even stem his whole army and kill the building base before Zerg can even finish his Banes. This is why rush distance matters, and the maps being so small is so bad for Zerg. Because IdrA completely trades out armies with him, and he's like, oh, okay, you have a handful left, I just lose the base then. And he can't really kill the middle base, it's turreted and PF'd. So here IdrA's going to try to retake the middle and get some control, but Jinro just has so much. IdrA will probably kill the tanks and then have to retreat again, as he cannot fight the Marines. IdrA's sitting there saying, well, I'm not going to be able to win a late game, and holy shit, more Banes coming in, as IdrA might actually be able to fight the Marines. Losing a lot of mutas. IdrA probably lost about half of his mutaflock and take a lot of damage on the mutas, and as IdrA once said in regards to why he left versus MMA, muta retention ZVT is everything, and IdrA lost over half his mutas. Whenever you're at such a disadvantage as Zerg, you really feel like, holy shit, I need to press, I need to make this work, I need to trade and be more aggressive than I would normally. We remember when IdrA beat MVP on Steps of War, he traded out like 10 mutas in the big game deciding engagement to kill a crucial amount, but IdrA's sort of petering out here, 3-base versus 3-base, the third is not really mining, the Zerg, make no mistakes about it, is behind. The Terran is scaling better, the Terran has better tech options, even though this has been somewhat of a scrappy game and we don't see as many workers as we might see in a modern game. You gotta remember, this is a tiny map where they spawn in on top of each other, so it's not really so easy to be able to say, oh, well, like they're making bad macro mistakes or the macro's bad. It's just totally different than what you or I would be used to playing, the tempo of the game and how everything would go. Look at Jinro move half a screen away from his fucking third base and be able to siege IdrA's fourth. IdrA surrounds the Thors with Mutaling. That's what you want because the mutas do splash damage. as far as their glaive goes, but they get countered by Thors, who have the javelin that does bonus damage to light units and a splash damage. The muta splash damage is sort of made for workers and relatively inconsequential, so that's why you have to fly in with mutas and use the hold position command to spread out the mutas over the Thor. It's called the magic box, which was like a cutting edge micro tactic back in this day. And again, IdrA's on no economy and has to GG, so... And a lot of times when IdrA leaves, it seems weird, and that might look like one of those times, because almost every time when a Zerg leaves a game, it's like, oh, they're being attacked, they lost a base, they lost their queens, they lost their army, and they died. And with IdrA, it was sort of like, okay, he's going to run in and fight with the mutas here, and whenever he lost the mutas, he left. Make no mistake about it, IdrA was behind. Jinro was ahead in workers. He had the capability to move out and take a fourth easily when IdrA absolutely could not. IdrA was pretty much doing an all-in version of a Mutaling Baneling. Whereas almost always when you see IdrA do Mutaling Baneling, it's the total standard macro mindset. But on a map like that, it's pretty much like, I have to kill him. And that's why we saw him try to trade aggressively with those mutas. And he almost made it work because his macro was so good. But Jinro, known as a macro player himself, takes that. And these matches were not online for over a decade, but some random guy named StarCraft Vids ripped them and re-uploaded them, so make sure to check out his channel. I'm going to link it in the description.